funding for Art of the Western World was provided by the Annenberg CPB project.
This is Siena, a wonderfully preserved medieval city in central Italy. At its heyday, around 1300, it was one of the most civilized and prosperous places in Europe. Siena and the other Italian city-states of its time, like Florence, can stand as a new beginning in our story of Western art. Hitherto, the old medieval worldview had, put simply, divided the classes of society into the aristocracy at the top, the church, and the laboring peasantry at the bottom. But in places like this, we see for the first time in European history a new class, conscious of its own identity, the merchants. These cities were no longer controlled by feudal lords. They were republics. Here in Siena, several thousand citizens were eligible for election to the governing bodies, which met down there in the Palazzo Pubblico. And in the Palazzo there is a fresco painted in the 1340s which encapsulates their faith in the secular arts of government, in the moderating power of reason in human society. It's called The Effects of Good Government. This marvelous fresco, painted by Ambrogio Lorenzetti, was the first panoramic landscape on this scale in Western art. The peasants bringing their produce from the countryside, the merchants going about their business, the elegant ladies of leisure, all are fused into an idealized image of the well-governed city-state. Eight years later, the Black Death devastated Siena. It killed the artist Lorenzetti and half the population of Europe. It was the greatest catastrophe in the modern history of the West, but surprisingly, for some regions, the plague was a springboard for economic growth. For the survivors, there were new opportunities. Florence recovered particularly quickly. By 1400, this was the city-state that dominated central Italy. The bankers and textile merchants were expanding their trading empires all over Europe. Over the next 100 years, an extraordinary interaction took place in Florence. The innovations of artists and architects, the excitement of rediscovering classical achievements, and the patronage of a wealthy commercial class. These key elements brought about a series of artistic and intellectual breakthroughs that came to be known as the Renaissance, literally the rebirth of learning and culture. In the church of Santa Croce, a series of frescoes painted around 1320 were to have a revolutionary effect on Florentine painting. Here, the great merchant families competed with one another to commission the leading artists to decorate their chapels. In the chapel of the Bardi family, Professor John White of University College London describes how these medieval images came to life.
This is a Franciscan church, and the Franciscans were the passionate preachers of the late medieval world. They used their words to tug at the emotions of the faithful, rich and poor alike. And at the same time, the painters increasingly tried to bring the Gospels and the stories of the saints to life before their very eyes. At first, as you can see in this late 13th century St. Francis altarpiece, they did it with stiff, imposing figures and with bright, doll-like symbolic scenes and images. And here next door, in a much ruined fresco, I'm afraid, painted probably only 30 or 40 years later, you can see the revolution represented by the art of Giotto, the great contemporary of the poet Dante. Here is a new, soft, warm reality, a new humanity and pathos, a new ability to take the faithful back and make them feel that they were actually there and filled with love for this loving saint whose love of Christ and love of life and of the beauties of the world wrought a transformation in the spiritual life of Europe.
Giotto's frescoes gave a new sense of weight to the human body, a new sense of urgency to narrative painting. They became an academy for later Italian artists. Raphael and Michelangelo came here to learn from such dramatic images as this, in which St. Francis receives the wounds of Christ upon his hands and feet.
Giotto's frescoes brought him immortality and undying fame to the chapel of the Bardi. They and families like them were moneylenders to the popes and kings of Europe. They were the pioneers of the new world of international finance, and the coinage of Florence, the gold florin, became the common currency of Christendom. Even John the Baptist, the saint of the desert and the enemy of luxury, is depicted surrounded by gold florins on the cover of a book containing the rules of the coin makers. But if the prosperity of Florence was owed to the bankers, the rebirth of its intellectual energy came from a rediscovery of classical culture.
Without ever leaving Santa Croce, we can move into the world of the Renaissance with this tomb of Leonardo Bruni, longtime Chancellor of Florence, who died in 1444. This was the Florence of the humanists, the students of the classics, of the knowledge and the wisdom of the ancient world. They went right back to the origins of Western thought in the great Greek philosophers. He also wrote a history of Florence, starting with Roman times. And in this great work, he put historical writing also onto a new footing, both in terms of its literary content and its scholarly underpinning. And there he lies, his history on his breast, surrounded by a wealth of classical detail, his bier supported by the Roman eagles, and his hope of heaven in the roundel of the Virgin and Child above his head. This monument in itself is a wordless combination of the Christian and the classical.
This is the Pantheon, the most perfectly preserved temple of ancient Rome. Scholars like Bruni and the artists of Renaissance Florence had a passionate love affair with antiquity. The humanists recovered and translated the texts. The artists studied the statues and the frescoes. But they were not simply copying the achievements of the ancient world, they were transforming them. This Renaissance design for an ideal city uses classical architecture to create a perfect environment based upon reason and order. And in perhaps the most famous image of man by a Renaissance artist, Leonardo da Vinci is illustrating the Roman author Vitruvius. Man, in his ideal proportions, is the measure of all things. Out of their preoccupation with classical harmony and proportion, Renaissance artists created these new images of man and woman.
Inside the Palazzo Vecchio, the 5,000 or so Florentines who had the right to vote would meet, summoned by the bell in times of crisis. They were the members of the influential guilds and represented the craftsmen and the most economically important activities. Sculptors and stoneworkers, textiles, metal workers, masons and builders, lawyers and solicitors. The engine driving the art of Florence at the beginning of the 15th century was competition between the guilds and competition between the artists commissioned by them. The Armourers' Guild paid for this powerful, alert image of their patron saint, St. George by Donatello. Roman art transformed into a vision of Christian courage. The Bankers' Guild paid for Ghiberti's expensive bronze statue of St. Matthew, the patron saint of money changers. These reliefs are the two front runners for the most famous of all Florentine competitions, held in 1401 to decide the commission for new bronze doors for the baptistry. The subject is the prophet Abraham, about to sacrifice his son Isaac, and this entry by the young Brunelleschi emphasizes the violence of the act. Abraham holds Isaac by the throat to plunge the knife in. The angel seizes Abraham's wrist in a dramatic last-minute intervention. But Lorenzo Ghiberti won the competition with this relief, immediately acknowledged as an exhibition of unrivaled craftsmanship. The nude figure of Isaac is based on classical models. This is a triumph of the goldsmith's craft, embodying lessons learned from antique statuary and combining that with a Gothic grace learned from the art of Northern Europe. Florence is still a thriving centre for the goldsmith's art. This is the studio of Signor Giorgio Chileri at the south end of the Ponte Vecchio, and he works here as a master with his apprentice craftsmen. Now, a whole generation of famous Florentine artists, Ghiberti, Brunelleschi, Donatello, began work in studios not unlike this, working on just such meticulous and minute creations before moving on in their careers to their monumental works of art. In such an environment where the skill of the craftsman is so highly prized, it was inevitable, perhaps, that their status should rise. Inevitable, too, that the most brilliant of them, men like Brunelleschi and Donatello, should resent the restrictions which the craft guilds could place on them, and resent, too, the implication that somehow their work was menial, a mechanical craft. And so, increasingly during this century, such artists came to see themselves as the equals of their patrons. No longer humble, anonymous craftsmen, but self-confident, ambitious, intellectual practitioners of the liberal arts, famous beyond their own city. Brunelleschi visited Rome after his unsuccessful submission for the baptistry doors competition. There he saw a great city in a state of decay. The sheer scale of the Roman ruins and the building techniques he analyzed provided inspiration for the greatest problem of structural engineering in Italy: how to complete the cathedral being built in Florence.
In this great space, we are surrounded by a Gothic architecture ripe for the Renaissance. The flat surfaces of the walls, the crisp, plainer detailing of the piers with their sharp angles, not a curve, not a rounded form in sight. It all looks so precise and so completely pre-planned. And yet, if we had stood here half a century after they began to build this building, we would have seen something very different. Behind me there, you would still have seen the medieval houses within the existing foundations. And then, as the piers went up, they were still arguing about how high they should be. When they came to those capitals, they had a competition about their precise form. They had plaster, wooden, stone models, and when all that was done, and they were still arguing about the precise dimensions of the building, they went on for 50 years, and not a man in Italy or Europe, let alone in Florence, would have had the foggiest idea of how they could ever put a dome over that great crossing that you see behind me there.
In 1417, A conference of architects was summoned from all over Italy to discuss the problem of how to construct the dome. And eventually, Brunelleschi was entrusted with the commission.
Standing here and looking down into the space, this 150-foot wide octagonal crossing, we can get some idea, at least, of what it was for Brunelleschi to be faced by the greatest architectural and engineering challenge which had confronted any Italian architect since the distant days of antiquity. It was quite impossible to fill this space with a forest of timber, and even if it had been, it would never have supported itself, let alone the weight of the cupola during its construction. So Brunelleschi's primary problem and his first triumph was to devise a form of scaffolding which started not at the ground, but 40 feet above our heads at the top of the drum. And then his second was to build the cupola in such a way that it was self-supporting in the course of its construction.
And this is an important part of Brunelleschi's structural solution: herringbone brickwork. Instead of simply laying rows of bricks horizontally, some of them were laid vertically to provide a kind of internal skeleton, locking the horizontal rings of brickwork into place whilst the mortar was setting.
Enormous scale involves enormous weight, and Brunelleschi's masterstroke in building his cupola was to devise a double shell, built first of stone and then of brick to lighten it still further. We are standing in one of the passageways between these two shells, and that, of course, solved his whole problem of access for his building materials and, of course, for subsequent maintenance, whilst the great ribs which bind the inner and the outer shells together ensure its strength and structural stability. When we come out into the light, out of the dark passages and tunnels of the dome, we are surrounded by the classic forms of Brunelleschi's lantern. As we look down, we can immediately understand exactly what his great contemporary and fellow architect Alberti meant when he spoke of this magnificent cupola rising above the skies, ample enough to encompass in its shadow all the people of Tuscany.
Not only did Brunelleschi's dome dominate the skyline of Florence, he also systematized the science of perspective, which was to dominate Western pictorial space until the 20th century. In Masaccio's fresco of the Trinity, probably constructed with Brunelleschi's advice on architecture, classical columns and a monumental barrel vault frame the figures of Christ and God the Father. Here is the interaction of painting, architecture, and the mathematical analysis of space that was unique to the Florentine Renaissance. In 1419, Brunelleschi had begun the Hospital of the Innocenti. It was the first orphanage in Europe to be funded by public donations, and the architecture is a delicate blending of the Roman and the Romanesque. It was Brunelleschi's architecture which the painter Fra Angelico depicted in his fresco of the Annunciation, which awaits you at the top of the stairs of the monastery of San Marco. Fra Angelico lived and worked here, decorating the monastery with scenes from the New Testament. Scenes striking for their simplicity and serenity. Inside the cells, the world seems to retreat, leaving a single image suspended like a spiritual vision. The buildings and frescoes of San Marco were paid for by one of the wealthiest Florentine bankers, Cosimo de' Medici, whose family symbol adorns the walls. Saint Cosmas was the patron saint of the Medici family, and in Fra Angelico's fresco, he kneels at the foot of the cross. This painting was at the entrance to the personal cell of Cosimo de' Medici, who would retreat from the pressures of business into this setting of intense spiritual devotion. The moment in the story of Christ that these patrician bankers identified with was the adoration of the Magi, the wise and wealthy paying homage to the baby Jesus. And this is the image that Fra Angelico painted inside Cosimo's cell. 30 years later, Botticelli painted the same scene for the same patrons, but now the powerful patrician families have taken over the religious stage. Cosimo the Elder is portrayed kneeling before the Madonna, while his grandson Lorenzo the Magnificent swaggers on one side. Every face in this painting is a portrait from the Medici court circle, including Botticelli himself. In another Botticelli portrait, a medallion of Cosimo the Elder is held by a fashionable young man. Botticelli's painting epitomizes the shift in patronage during the second part of the 15th century, away from the world of public competition into the private space of the Florentine palazzo. The patrician families of Florence erected monuments to their own prestige in the palazzi of the 15th century. Palazzo Rucellai by the architect Alberti was admired for its classical detail and the elegance of its proportions. More magnificent was the palace designed for Cosimo de' Medici. This was not simply a home, but the center of a vast banking empire. Massive doors and rough rusticated masonry on the ground floor, increasingly smoother stonework above, created a style that was to be imitated by palaces and banks in Europe and America for the next 500 years. The Medici created an elegant society where artists and scholars studied astrology and mythology, reviving antiquity for their private pleasure. Cosimo commissioned the humanist Ficino to translate the works of Plato, and out of this intellectual climate came the paintings of Botticelli, combining the sensuality of pagan mythology with themes and images from Christian art. In his painting of the Primavera, Zephyrus, the wind god, enters the scene and seizes the wood nymph Chloris, whose mouth issues flowers as she is transformed into Flora, the goddess of spring. In the center stands a figure who resembles both the Christian Madonna and Venus, the goddess of love, and who directs the dance of the three graces. Naked Venus, seen here in Botticelli's The Birth of Venus, symbolized divine love. This was a nude based on classical forms, which also suggests a baptism and a rebirth.
In Renaissance Florence, the nude again became the focus of artistic effort. Donatello's David, probably commissioned by the Medici, with its obvious reflection of the Roman past, is a masterpiece of technical virtuosity and erotic suggestion. But it was more than that. It was also a brilliantly inventive symbol of the Christian faithful, armored only in the Word of God. Finally, in Brunelleschi's church of San Lorenzo, we find the two bronze pulpits that Donatello left unfinished at his death in 1466. Here, for the first time in Western art, we find a true late style that leads on to the work of Titian and of Rembrandt. Leaving behind the technical perfection of his early work, Donatello now engages with his material in a rougher, more direct manner, biting into the bronze with his chisel to convey a more emotionally charged message. Here, in the harrowing of hell, Christ's urgent figure reaches through the crowding souls to seize the arm of Abraham and pull him to salvation. And when Christ's heavy figure surges from the tomb, it is not a joyous resurrection, but a battle won against the odds. Below, the soldiers sleep as the old order passes. Christ's face seems burdened with the sins of all mankind as he climbs up from darkness into light. The fleeing devil of the harrowing has become a scorpion on a Roman shield. Then, finally, the drama of salvation is resolved as the ascending Christ looks down in love and takes his leave of his apostles.
Looking over the rooftops and domes of the city, we can try to take an overview of that extraordinary period of artistic outpouring. It was, after all, a city whose population never even reached 100,000, continually riven by faction and strife, and yet which produced some of the greatest figures in the history of Western culture, from Giotto and Dante to Michelangelo and Leonardo. It was, for example, a Florentine, Amerigo Vespucci, with Florentine maps and instruments, who named the continent discovered by Columbus. The founder of modern science, Galileo, worked in this city. With all of them, it is the freshness of their thought, their willingness to experiment, their modernity, which impresses us today. But there is another side to the story. Civilized human life depends not only on modernity, but on a healthy assimilation of the past, both critical and imaginative. The Middle Ages had proved incapable of doing that. But here, in the Florentine Renaissance, we can see the reintegration of the classical worldview into modern life. Not merely their learning, but their pagan humanism and their pantheism with its incomparably rich mythological themes, which, as we now understand, contain such profound psychological insights. What we see here in Florence is what they made of that tradition, just as this is what we are making of them. But its continued reinterpretation is a necessity for the West if it is to understand its own cultural tradition. The art of Renaissance Florence came out of the city-states of central Italy. By contrast, our story of art in Northern Europe begins in the late medieval courts of France. It was a time of violent contrasts. In the luxury of the court, the Duke enjoys his banquet, while the peasants shelter from the snow. In their hovel, they bear themselves by the fire. These illuminations were painted around 1414 by three brothers from the Netherlands, the Limburgs, at the French court of the Duke of Berry. The detailed realism of these faces and landscapes was to be a key feature of northern art in this period. The Limburg brothers began their career working for the brother of the Duke of Berry, Philip the Bold, Duke of Burgundy. The Valois Dukes of Burgundy established one of the strangest and most extravagant courts of late medieval Europe. From their base in Burgundy, by marriage and diplomacy, they acquired large areas of the Netherlands to build an extensive, though fragmented state of vast wealth. In 1404, Duke Philip the Bold died at the Stag Inn near Brussels. 20 years earlier, his royal sculptors had begun work on Philip's tomb. One of them carved these images of the funeral procession which transported his body back to Burgundy.
Clothed in the habit of a Carthusian monk, Philip's embalmed body was sealed in a great lead coffin and then carried in a funeral cortege which took nearly 7 weeks to wind the 250 miles from Brussels to Dijon. Accompanied by his sons, his chaplains, and members of his royal court, the hearse was drawn by 6 horses caparisoned in black, with the blue banners of Burgundy fluttering at its corners. At Dijon, it was received not only by the weeping clergy, but by 100 chosen townspeople and 100 poor, also clad in black at the Duke's expense. And so, as with the other great royal and ducal rituals of the later Middle Ages, death itself could be turned into an act of public theatre. Philip's tomb itself lay just outside Dijon, at the Carthusian monastery of Champmol. It took nearly 30 years to complete and was finished after his death in 1414. 3 sculptors worked on it, but among them was a forgotten genius of European art, the man who conceived this remarkable evocation of that funeral procession, Klaus Sluter.
He came from Haarlem in the Netherlands and worked for the Duke of Burgundy for 20 years in Dijon. Sluter's most impressive carving was a life-size monument known as the Well of Moses, with prophets from the Old Testament around its base. The well was placed at the center of the monastery of Champmol, where the Dukes of Burgundy were buried. In Italy, Donatello was only 10 years old when Sluter began to carve these figures, which display an intense realism never seen before in European sculpture. As this reconstructed model shows, the Well of Moses was originally brilliantly painted. The prophets deliver their prophecies like figures from a medieval mystery play. The whole piece was intensely theatrical, linking the prophecies of the Old Testament to the sacrifice of Christ on the cross. And originally the well was surmounted by a life-sized crucifixion group. This crucifix was smashed to pieces during the French Revolution, and the largest fragment that remains is the head of Christ. Somehow, Sluter's carving conveys both the agony of Christ on the cross and the release from suffering which death has brought. Life at the Burgundian court was not always dominated by thoughts of God and death. The Dukes of Burgundy were famous for their tournaments, their banquets, and their extravagance. They placed great importance on all the arts, so their court could be seen and heard as one of the grandest in Europe. Because this was a traveling court, moving between the palaces of their scattered duchy, many of their artistic treasures were portable: tapestries, metalwork, and illuminated manuscripts. All this medieval extravagance was principally paid for by the Burgundian Netherlands, the most highly urbanized area of Europe. During the 15th century, Bruges became the busiest port in northern Europe, while Brussels and Ghent became two of its largest industrial cities. We can catch a realistic glimpse of Flemish urban life through the window of religious paintings, such as this Madonna by Robert Campin. In Italy, 15th century artists used perspective and the study of antiquity to depict a suitable setting for their religious paintings. By contrast, a northern painter such as Campin, in his Mérode altarpiece, saw no great divide between the distant past and the present, between the look of antiquity and the late medieval world. Joseph, in his carpenter's workshop, is depicted with detailed realism, both the tools of his trade and the townscape visible through the window. One sign of the success of Bruges as a trading centre was its wealthy community of Italian merchants and bankers. Out of this community came the most famous wedding portrait in Western art.
Here in 1434, Jan van Eyck shows Giovanni Arnolfini, a hugely wealthy Italian moneylender and tapestry dealer to Duke Philip the Good of Burgundy. He is about to marry an equally wealthy young Italian, Giovanna Cenami, whose family lived in France. And here you see the shifty, rabbity banker, one hand raised and the other joined to that of his new bride. The artist proclaims his witnessing presence in a bold Gothic legal inscription in Latin. This reads, Jan van Eyck was here. While Italians were developing their illusionistic art with the assistance of mathematically reasoned perspective, northern painters, led by Jan van Eyck, used many translucent layers of pigments and quick-drying oils to produce uniquely convincing pictorialism. Among Jan's most compelling portraits, this man's features may be the artist's own. They have some of that fixed, almost hypnotic quality that sometimes results from staring into a mirror for self-portrayal. We also know that artists in the 15th century often wore such flamboyant red turbans, which is another reason for suspecting that the identity of the sitter is Jan van Eyck himself. The most famous European painter of his day, Jan van Eyck was also a diplomat, mapmaker, and chemist. Enormously learned, he was concerned with Latin and Greek and studied Hebrew mysticism. Here Jan van Eyck depicts the most powerful figure at the Burgundian court, Chancellor Rollin, kneeling before the Madonna. In such works, a saint usually presented the donor, the person paying for the painting, to the Virgin and Child. But Rollin decided to appear before the Madonna without benefit of introduction. So Van Eyck linked the figures with Romanesque architecture and a view of the heavenly city and landscape beyond, realized by the almost magical glow of the oil medium.
Nicolas Rollin was the chief minister of Duke Philip the Good of Burgundy for nearly 40 years. He became one of the wealthiest and most powerful men in Europe, and at the height of his career, he made a spectacular donation to charity. The Hôtel Dieu, or God's Hostel, a hospital for the poor, was founded by Chancellor Rollin in Beaune, close to the Duke's capital at Dijon. The initials of Nicolas Rolin and of his wife Gigonne de Salin and their coats of arms appear in the stained glass and the floor tiles of the buildings, making it clear that the hospital was a gigantic memorial to the donors.
On this Sunday, the 4th of August 1443, neglecting all human cares and in the interests of my salvation, in recognition of the goodness of our Saviour, from whom all benefits proceed, I found and donate irrevocably in the town of Beaune a hospital for the poor and the sick.
Such acts of piety were often performed by the rich in the Middle Ages for the good of their souls, but seldom on this massive scale. In this case, contemporaries viewed Rolin's wealth with hatred and his professions of charity and spirituality with cynicism. And it's one of the mysteries of the time that such men seem to combine an austere, rigid piety with excesses of cruelty, of calculating greed, and of, to us, sickening ostentation. King Louis XI himself said of Rolin, he made enough people poor to make a pauper's hospital necessary. And the hospital was where the poor came to die. Here in the Middle Ages were 2 rows of 31 beds where the poor lay 2 or 3 to a bed. The 15th century was a time of terrible famine, war, and plague. And in a bad year, thousands of people could die in a place like this. And so, thoughtfully, the Chancellor had provided that each of his patients could look from his or her bed to the wall above the high altar, where there hung a tremendous vision of the end, the last judgment of Roger van der Weyden.
On the day of judgment, the dead rise from the earth to be judged by their Saviour. Christ sits enthroned in glory above the Archangel Michael, who holds the scales which will weigh the vices and virtues of all who are to be judged on the day of reckoning. St. John the Baptist, Mary, the 12 apostles, and other holy figures intercede on behalf of the sinners, and the lucky few are ushered through a bland Gothic gateway into the kingdom of heaven. This painting was done with bright colors, so it could be seen by the sick even from their deathbeds. Van der Weyden excelled at depicting the inner emotions of his characters, and on Christ's left we see the damned in a state of frenzy, drawn inexorably towards the flames of hell. There are no demons to drag them down. In the words of a local theologian, the weight of sin upon the conscience is sufficient to make the damned fall into hell as heavy as lead. As the year 1500 approached, many were convinced they were living through the last days of mankind. While the Turks threatened Christendom from the outside, Europe was tormented by political and religious tensions. In the Netherlands, Hieronymus Bosch painted this strange vision of hell, composed of images suggesting the psychological disintegration of the late medieval world and the tensions of his time. Industrial furnaces, armies on the march, artillery bombardments at night. The German printmaker who took the apocalypse, as described in the Revelation of St. John the Divine, and transformed it into his own pictorial territory was Albrecht Dürer, the first major artist to publish his work in the form of a book.
Dürer exploited contemporary interest in the revelations of St. John by designing and carving 15 woodcut block prints, which reduced the 22 chapters of St. John's text into an extraordinarily action-packed visual adventure which swept Western Europe. It made him the most famous graphic artist of his day, and the series itself was of enduring fame, used by artists, sculptors, painters, graphic designers for the next 500 years.
Albrecht Dürer was clearly a precocious artist. He was the son of a Nuremberg goldsmith and drew this portrait of himself at the age of 13. He became the first artist in Western art to make a detailed series of self-portraits throughout his life, analyzing his changes of mood and image. Dürer studied nature with the same incisive vision with which he analyzed himself. He was one of the first artists to go into the open to paint watercolors from direct observation. He wrote, "We German artists have grown up like wild trees in the forest, knowing nothing of the rules of proportion and perspective." These watercolors were painted while Dürer was traveling from Nuremberg to Venice. He wished to learn from Italian art and to have his own status as an artist acknowledged in the land of the Renaissance. Venetian paintings from around 1500 show the city that Dürer visited, the wealthiest trading center in Europe. Giovanni Bellini, who painted this portrait of the Doge of Venice, was described by Dürer as very old, but still the best of the Venetian painters. The young German was gratified that this Italian master should ask him for one of his works. Bellini and his contemporaries had been influenced by Northern art, its realism, its sensitivity to light and landscape, and Bellini had become a master of the Northern technique of oil painting. In his depiction of St. Francis, the whole landscape seems to convey the ecstasy of the saint's vision.
After Dürer's second Venetian journey, he engraved some of his most intricate, complex plates. In Night, Death, and the Devil, the artist takes the equestrian statue he had seen in Italy and rides it into a northern forest. Here is the man of action, the warrior, blind to the perils that surround him, death at his side, the devil and devastation in his wake. Dürer's radiant engraving of St. Jerome is a hymn to the contemplative life, showing his favorite saint in sacred study. Subtlety of light and the detailed depiction of the interior all recall Van Eyck's art. For his figure of brooding melancholy, Dürer may have used a Michelangelo Sibyl as his model. Melancholy is the dark side of genius. The discarded tools, a plane and saw, instruments and inkwell, all convey the frustrated artist, his creativity blocked.
Albrecht Dürer was a northern genius who succeeded in assimilating the lessons of the South. The last and boldest statement of northern religious art
can be found in the Isenheim altarpiece, the work of a German master.
This massive altar in 3 stages is by the artist we know as Matthias Grunewald. In many ways, it is the ultimate painting in Christian art. Never again would a painter feel quite so free to express the mysteries of Christian faith, ranging from agony to ecstasy. This altarpiece was painted around 1515 for an Antonite monastery which specialized in the care of skin diseases. The crucifixion is shown with unprecedented impact, in horrific immediacy, like a monstrous affliction, the last word in Teutonic torture. Mary swoons in the arms of St. John the Evangelist as the kneeling Magdalene twists her hands in impotent grief. In the wings, 2 healing saints, Sebastian and Antony, stand like living statues. Because the panels of this altarpiece had to be separated, we need to look at a model to understand how it unfolded. Mary reads the prophecy of Isaiah, "Behold, a virgin shall conceive," as she is interrupted by the Archangel Gabriel's annunciation. An angelic orchestra in the Temple of Solomon celebrates this mystical union of heaven and earth by its harmonious celestial music. These happy sounds may also refer to musical therapy practiced in medieval hospitals. Shown as if defined by light alone, this is the most convincing resurrection ever painted. Prophet of the atomic age, Grunewald conveys a sense of weightlessness as Christ rises. For the final opening, painted wings contrast with a sculpted centerpiece. St. Anthony is enthroned in triumph at the center and shown again at the left, meeting Paul the Hermit in his forest retreat. For this scene of St. Anthony's torment and trial in the wilderness, the artist brings back all the irrational, the images of monsters that he saw in medieval art and that of the 15th century. He gives them an amazing quality of reality, a sense of immediacy. Half human, a fearfully diseased demon clutches his prayer book in a bag. An inscription in the corner could apply to him as well as to the patients at the Hospital of St. Anthony. "Where are you, good Jesus? Where are you? Why haven't you come to heal my wounds?" New classical idealism from Renaissance Italy ended the spontaneous realism and imagination of Grunewald's art. 2 new views of Christianity also finished the free inquiry found in his painting. Both Protestantism and Catholicism had their own rigorous ideas of just how religious subjects ought to be shown, and these rather narrow concepts really ended the wild fantasies, the quality of individuality, which is so extraordinarily powerful in the monument that we have just seen.
5 years after Grunewald painted the Isenheim altarpiece, Albrecht Dürer made the last of his journeys. Not southwards to Italy this time, but westwards to the Netherlands, to Brussels, and to Antwerp. And there comes one of those electric moments when the life of art and the current of history come together. For there, Dürer was astonished by the beauty of looted Aztec gold, which had been unloaded in ships from Mexico. Wonderful works of art, he called them, the like of which he had never seen in his life. It was also a vision of the future, For the center of gravity of the West was beginning to shift from the Mediterranean to the western seaboard, and to towns like Antwerp and London, which would finance the domination of the West up to the present day. But that lay in the future. In the story of art, the powerhouse was still Italy. And the time of Dürer in the north was, in the south, the time of Michelangelo. And in Rome, the Renaissance was about to reach its climax.
Funding for Art of the Western World was provided by the Annenberg CPB project.
The Pantheon, the most complete monument from the days of ancient Rome. The Pantheon, Temple of the Gods. In 1520, the artist Raphael was buried here, the first man in modern times to choose the Pantheon as his own memorial. When Raphael died, he was only 37, at the height of his creativity and the peak of his fame. The story was told that the Pope himself wept at the news of this sudden death. As final tribute, Raphael's last great painting, The Transfiguration, was placed at the head of his coffin. The biographer Giorgio Vasari wrote,
"When this admirable artist died, painting also died. It is due to him that the arts, coloring and invention have been brought to such perfection that progress is almost impossible. Happy were those who served under him, because all who imitate his art are sure to succeed in the world, as those who imitate his virtuous life will be rewarded in heaven."
Raphael had become the subject of myth, even in his own lifetime. A myth compounded by his dying on a Good Friday. There were even stories of earthquakes following his death, as on the first Good Friday. And the myth perhaps helps to understand why it was possible for him to be buried here. But his own motives come out clearly in his will. in which he leaves money for the restoration of this most perfect survival from the Roman world, desiring to be immortalized within the very fabric of antiquity which he had helped bring back to life, at once defining his aims as an artist and his status. The status of artists had grown during the 14th and 15th centuries, but now suddenly we find them compared with princes. In writers as different as Castiglione, Aretino, and Vasari, we find not only their works, but even their private lives, the subject of serious consideration. Popes tolerate their tantrums, rich men indulge their whims. In men like Raphael, then, Leonardo, and Michelangelo, this is the moment when the idea of the artist becomes synonymous with genius.
In Raphael's Transfiguration, we see the revolution in painting that he had helped to create. The measured symmetry of 15th century painting, controlled by strict perspective, had exploded into something infinitely more complex. Colors had become more brilliant and various, glowing from out of shadow. Gestures had become more expressive. The individuality of the figures had become dramatized by their inner emotions. This revolution, in artistic ambition as much as in painting, had been inspired by an artist who was an old man when Raphael died, Leonardo da Vinci. Though he was equally mythologized, Leonardo's long career was very different from the starry successes of Raphael. Leonardo's story is a catalogue of unprecedented achievement, and yet also of incomplete and abandoned projects, no better symbolized than by the sorry state of his mural for a monastery in Milan, depicting the Last Supper of Christ. The art historian Kathleen Weil-Garris-Brandt sees Leonardo's frustrated ambition as part of a larger story.
Most of us have some sort of mental image of Leonardo's Last Supper. And yet this is true also with some of the other famous artistic projects of the Renaissance. As we approach more closely, we discover that the actual work survives only in part. It's often difficult to reconstruct the artist's intention, to know what the work was to look like originally, to grasp something of the setting for which it was created. What remains to us of Leonardo's masterpiece is slowly being revealed to us by the painstaking work of conservators here. And yet, the painting has suffered so much damage over the centuries that it is bound to remain a ghost of its former visual splendor, compelling, evocative, but also elusive. It makes a poignant visual metaphor for the fragmented image of the Renaissance that's come down to us, and it also serves to remind us of the insuperable practical difficulties that sometimes separated an act of high artistic imagination from its concrete physical realization in actual works of art. With the Last Supper, the problem was that Leonardo had the ambition of developing new methods for wall painting, and from a technical point of view that turned out to be catastrophic. The painting began to decay as soon as it was finished. In other heroic enterprises like Michelangelo's tomb for Pope Julius II or Bramante's designs for the new St. Peter's, the ambitious scale of the project itself doomed it eventually to incompletion, reduction, or transformation.
Yet if we look carefully at the fragmented remains of the Last Supper, we can still discern a complex work. The figure of Christ sits stable and calm at the center of a storm. The disciples surround him as though rolled back by a burst of energy, each reacting in a different way to the accusation, "One of you shall betray me." The disciples are young and old, beautiful and ugly. They give expression to their feelings, but they also express the idea of the first Christian Mass. A monk witnessed Leonardo at work in the monastery of Santa Maria delle Grazie in Milan.
Many a time I have seen Leonardo go early in the morning to work on the platform before the Last Supper, and there he would stay from sunrise till darkness, never laying down a brush, but continuing to paint without eating or drinking. Then 3 or 4 days would pass without his touching the work. Yet each day he would spend several hours examining it and criticizing the figures to himself.
There are very few works still existing which reveal what Leonardo did to transform 15th century painting, yet his influence on subsequent generations was enormous. One of his final paintings, The Virgin and St. Anne of 1507, reveals some of the qualities which made him so influential. St. Anne holds her virgin daughter Mary on her lap as the infant Christ reaches for the Lamb of God. Leonardo organized these figures into a pyramid of intertwined gazes, gestures, and forms. He veiled the figures and the landscape beyond them in a soft atmospheric haze. Muted colors glow out of darkness. The effect is lifelike, yet beyond life, an image of idealized beauty and transcendent love. In his few paintings, Leonardo created an ideal, but his inspiration was closely observed nature. His almost numberless drawings reveal how he expanded the artist's role so it embraced philosophy and science. He described this lifetime project in the most ambitious terms.
The deity which invests the science of the painter functions in such a way that the mind of the painter is transformed into a copy of the divine mind. If the painter wishes to see beauties that charm him, it lies in his power to create them. And if he wishes to see monstrosities that are frightful, ridiculous, or truly pitiable, he is Lord and God thereof.
Portrait of the artist as a young man. Not literally a portrait, but certainly one in spirit. Michelangelo was 27 when he started to carve the figure of David for his home city of Florence. He portrayed the supreme confidence of a young conqueror, and yet in the same moment he revealed self-doubt, perhaps the self-doubt of an artist with heroic ambition. If Leonardo was ahead of his times, Michelangelo was supremely a man of his times. From the very beginning, he found himself at the center of power and influence.
The project to create a Colossus of marble had been underway since the early 15th century, and the block from which Michelangelo's David was quarried was brought down from Carrara in the 1460s. Several attempts were made to have the block carved, but they all came to naught. It was, in fact, the first monumental freestanding male nude carved in marble since antiquity. Michelangelo himself is a David who confronts the gigantic challenge of the marble that no one has been able successfully to carve. Originally, Michelangelo's David was to have been placed on a buttress of Florence Cathedral. But by the time the David was complete, it was clear to everyone at once that this was a miracle of art, as it was called in its own time, a kind of achievement that should be integrated in the Florentine body politic in its broadest sense. Now, David is the young biblical hero who, against all the odds, manages to overcome the armed giant Goliath. So David is the metaphor for the miraculous victory of right over might. So it's no surprise to us that Florence should, throughout its history, have seen itself as a David among the city-states, maintained against its powerful enemies because of its righteousness.
In 1873, the Florentine city fathers decided to bring Michelangelo's David indoors from the Piazza della Signoria here to this museum, the Accademia. Later, a copy was put up on the site, but Michelangelo's sculpture itself here was deprived of its original role as a civic guardian and was redefined more narrowly, more exclusively as a work of art. Other sculptures by Michelangelo were also gathered here as if to bring together a sort of secular shrine to the great Florentine. But this historical happenstance gives us the opportunity to look at Michelangelo from a different perspective, to look at his unfinished works, sculptures that he was forced to abandon for a variety of reasons entirely beyond his control. Michelangelo had a very unusual way of approaching the block of marble when it came from the quarry. This is the skin of the stone as it has been prepared by the quarry master. And Michelangelo began cutting from the front face only, moving in layer by layer into the stone as though he were carving a relief. Or as his contemporary says, it's as though a wax model were being lifted out of a bath of water. Obviously, the forms that are closest to us emerge first from the marble. This technique or system had two advantages. First, it meant that Michelangelo could organize the composition of his figure of the pose on one plane as though it were a picture and keep visual control of it as he carved inward through the block. It also meant that the process of design, the creative process of changing his mind, could continue while he was actually carrying out the statue, working it in the stone.
Michelangelo abandoned the Matthew sculpture in 1505 when he was summoned to Rome by the new Pope, Julius II. Pope Julius demanded a tomb which would match the majesty of his self-image. Michelangelo's original design was for a freestanding pyramid of marble with tier upon tier of life-size figures, so ambitious a design that many artists would have had to work for many years to make it real. Only one figure on the final tomb, completed 30 frustrating years later, carries the force of the original idea, the figure of Moses.
Vasari calls Michelangelo terribile, speaks often of his terribilità, which is a word that really has no precise equivalent in English, but one is talking about, I suppose, a kind of awe-inspiring power of temperament. And this same word, terribilità, was also used to describe Pope Julius II. There is no doubt that artist and Pope met their match in each other. And it's always been felt, there's a kind of undercurrent of feeling that although the Moses is in no sense a portrait of Julius II, that it is an evocation precisely of that terribilità that artist and Pope shared.
Michelangelo was bullied by Julius to abandon the tomb and instead to paint the ceiling of the Sistine Chapel. This was part of Julius' grand design for a new Vatican. However reluctant he was, however much he complained, between 1508 and 1512, Michelangelo created one of the boldest and one of the largest paintings in history. Monumental figures act out the biblical drama from the creation to the flood, framed by figures still more monumental. The human body became as much the subject of Michelangelo's painting as it was of his sculpture. Pope Julius had neither armies nor cannon enough to influence Europe as he might wish, but he could at least present in the microcosm of the Vatican an image of papal power to impress all comers. The story is told that Raphael was mightily impressed when he was smuggled in to see the unfinished Sistine ceiling by the architect of the new St. Peter's, Bramante. Certainly, in the decorations of the Pope's library, which Raphael was painting at the same time, there is a figure answering to the description of Michelangelo. There's evidence the figure was added later than the others, and its style seems a tribute to the style of his rival. The School of Athens, in a setting which evokes Bramante's designs for St. Peter's, is part of a sophisticated presentation of abstract ideas. In this case, the ideas of philosophy expressed in human form. Plato points towards heaven, Aristotle towards the earth. To the left, mathematics is personified by Pythagoras, surrounded by inquiring minds. To the right, Euclid, portrayed in the guise of Raphael's friend, Bramante, demonstrates the principles of geometry. Behind them, Raphael shows himself, staring out at the spectator. The artist stands proud in the company of philosophers. On the facing wall is the Disputa, Raphael's depiction of theology. At the center, beneath the Christian Trinity, is the bread of Christ symbolizing his body, God made flesh. Contemporary churchmen engage in debate with religious figures from all ages. On the side walls of the Pope's library are representations of justice and literature. The Christian and pagan worlds are brought together without conflict. The classical god Apollo is surrounded by his muses. They preside over the ancient writers Sappho, Virgil, Homer, and the almost contemporary Dante.
There is a continuity between the golden age of antiquity and the new golden age that Julius II was attempting to generate in his own papal Rome. We know that he saw himself as the ecclesiastical, the churchly successor to the emperors of ancient Rome. You can imagine that people who came here and saw the Pope here came away with a very strong feeling of the Church's unity, power, wisdom, and wealth. Perhaps something of an ideal projection rather than a celebration of fact.
It was not only popes who wished to place themselves in the tradition of antiquity. Agostino Chigi was banker to Pope Julius and his successor, Pope Leo, consequently one of the richest men in Europe. He persuaded Raphael to decorate his new villa on the banks of the Tiber. Raphael created the illusion of two canopies to protect Chigi's guests from the heat of the day. The gods dined above, while the guests dined below, tossing their golden plates over the riverbank as they finished each course. Chigi, by the way, kept servants below, so the plates could be recovered. Mercury, the god of money, presided over this splendid party, and thus gave the pleasures of the flesh more elevated status. But the party, metaphorical and actual, did not last for long. Vasari wrote,
Raphael kept up his secret love affairs and pursued his pleasures with no sense of moderation. And then on one occasion he went to excess, and he returned home afterwards with a violent fever which the doctors diagnosed as being caused by heat stroke. Raphael kept quiet about his incontinence, and, very imprudently, instead of giving him the restoratives he needed, they bled him until he grew faint and felt himself sinking. So he made his will.
In 1 year, they were all dead. Agostino Chigi and Raphael died within a month of each other. And in 1521, in the next year, Leo X was dead also. and with him the hedonistic culture of their age.
The grand presentations of papal Rome had masked the declining power of papal authority, religious, political, and military. In 1527, Italy was invaded by an imperial army from north of the Alps. Rome was sacked. Pietro Aretino described the traumatic events.
Screams rose to high heaven. Doors were beaten in. The whole population took to its heels, weeping and trying to hide. Blood flowed over the pavements. People were being slaughtered. The tortured shrieked. Prisoners begged for mercy. Women tore their hair. It was pitiful to see fire consuming gilded lodges and painted palaces.
Michelangelo's Last Judgment, painted in the 1530s on the wall beneath the Sistine ceiling, evokes a new mood of retribution. Rome did revive, of course, and the papacy gained new strength for its fight with the tide of Reformation. And Michelangelo continued with his monumental projects. He became architect of St. Peter's. He reworked the language of classical architecture into a massive sculptural style. He was commissioned to rebuild the civic square of Rome, the Piazza Campidoglio. On a hill above the Forum, he created a classical frame for the medieval city hall, a stage for the drama of politics. As he had with St. Peter's, Michelangelo used a bold reworking of classical architecture and integrated ancient statues into his design. Throughout his life, as architect and artist, Michelangelo had stayed at the center of power, a turbulent force in turbulent times.
But there is another journey in his life as an artist, which became increasingly important to him. A journey equally heroic, equally mythic, but private. It's revealed in his most intimate productions, in his letters, in his sonnets and sketches. And it takes him away from this public stage into his inner life, questioning the role of the artist and indeed the very nature of art itself.
In his final years, Michelangelo wrote a profoundly personal sonnet.
In a frail boat, through stormy seas, my life in its course has now reached the harbor, the bar of which all men must cross to render account of good and evil done. I now know how weighted in error was the fond fantasy which made art for me an idol and a king, and how mistaken that earthly love which all men seek. What of those thoughts of love, once light and gay, as towards two deaths I move? One is certain, the other menaces. No brush, no chisel quietens the soul. Once turned to the divine love of he who stretches out his arms upon the cross.
Michelangelo had excavated into the block so deeply, had changed his ideas about the design so many times, that there simply may not have been enough marble left for him to complete any of the images that are suggested all at once in the stone. Michelangelo probably wouldn't have seen the Rondanini Pietà as a work of art, but it does show his unceasing attempts, until just a few days before his death, to work through the stone to that image of unifying love that he strove for. The wall of ice between himself and Christ that he speaks of is here dissolved in a final loving union between mother and child.
This most illustrious and noble city, none other is more famous for the immensity of its glory, the wisdom of its government, the long duration of its rule, or for other features worthy of praise. The matchless convenience of its admirable buildings, the wealth of incredible riches, its numberless subjects, the industry of excellent men, the infinite variety of its possessions, the divine institutions of the Republic, the immortal value of its nobles.
You Venetians are wrong to disturb the peace of Italy, and not to rest content with the fine state that is yours. If you knew how everyone hates you, your hair would stand on end.
In the 16th century, Venice was a city of spectacle and rhetoric, of theatre and illusion. It saw itself as an ideal city, as the modern culmination of the ancient city-state, with its good life, its humane values, its sense of play even. And it dramatized itself as an ideal city, both for its own inhabitants and for the world outside. This civic drama was acted out through processions, ceremonies and spectacle, and through art and architecture. But this grand illusion, whose stage was the city itself, was founded in reality. By the 1500s, Venice claimed 1,000 years of history as a free and independent republic. The chill wind of economic change, the decline of empire, had not yet touched its self-confidence. It was still rich in trade and crafts. Its imperial possessions still spread out across the Mediterranean and into the Italian mainland, as here at Vicenza. So the theatre and the spectacle were props for a powerful empire which had survived for so long by hard-headed business acumen, by skillful diplomacy, and when those failed, by sheer military force.
The cast of characters who paraded on this spectacular stage included the gods of antiquity, whose attributes the city took as its own. Like ancient Athens, Venice personified itself as a woman, as Serenissima, the serene, as Venus, the sensual. The city even claimed a special relationship with the Virgin Mary, virtuous and pure. Behind its spectacular mask, the Republic used its prisoners of war as slaves, employed thousands of prostitutes, and preserved the privilege of democracy for a small clique of nobles. But compared with the tyrannies of princes and popes, Venice in the 16th century seemed uniquely free. It attracted talent from the rest of Italy, men like Jacopo Sansovino, who brought from Rome a language of architecture and sculpture ideal for Venice's desire to impress. David Rosand has analyzed the visual language of Sansovino.
At the foot of the Campanile, opposite the entrance to the Doge's palace, Sansovino created a loggia, a small porch whose monumental sculptural decoration and classical architectural form declared the virtues of the Republic. The reigning image of the complex was the figure of Venice herself, Venice triumphant, Venice personified as justice, the highest virtue of the state. To that traditional imagery, however, Sansovino brought a new kind of language from Rome, the language of the Olympian gods. The figure of Minerva, of course, represents wisdom, the wisdom of the ancients who were so clever as to have established this constitutional republic. The figure of Mercury represents eloquence, and eloquence is one of the fundamental political virtues of Venice. We must also remember that Mercury is the god of commerce, and that is the real foundation of Venice. The figure of peace is, of course, the ultimate virtue that is guaranteed by Venice. Venice brings peace to the world in the way that the ancient Romans had brought peace to the world. And then there is Apollo. Apollo is, after all, god of the sun, Sol in Italian. And Sol also stands for one, that is solo. And Apollo is one, Apollo is unique. Apollo is alone in all of this, just as, of course, Venice is alone, unique in the world.
Venetian artists, Giorgione, Veronese, Tintoretto, and above all Titian, transformed these public personifications and made them private, poetic, and desirable, paintings commissioned by men who were proud of their sophistication.
The Venus of Urbino is domesticated. She's brought indoors. She's put into the context of the bedroom. Two handmaids are in the background. One of them kneels over a chest, a marriage chest, the kind of chest that would hold a trousseau. So a marital theme is established there as surely as it is established by the myrtle plant that is so prominently silhouetted in the background. The myrtle, a plant in perpetual bloom as a symbol of perpetual love. The dog asleep at her feet, a symbol of fidelity. As overtly sensual as her appeal is, this Venus invites us to celebrate marital love. The attributes around her make this very clear, and yet she has lost none of her sensuality. Indeed, she will be transformed by Titian into a variety of other figures. One of the variations Titian produced is the image that includes Venus with a Cupid. There are a few prominent symbols that Titian has introduced, which are really quite ironic in a way, and give us some sense of the range of cultural play available in this kind of painting. The partridge is a bird that Titian actually used in a scene of the Annunciation, because in ancient mythology, it is a bird that is so highly sexed that merely the voice of the male or the wind from his beating wings is sufficient to impregnate the female. So too with the glass vase with its rose, the imagery of light passing through glass without breaking it, symbolically embodying the passage of the Logos, of the Word of God, of the Incarnation through the Virgin without destroying her virginity. The dog now is awake. No longer does he seem to stand for fidelity, but rather seems to activate the scene by his yapping. And certainly it would have been the kind of visual punning that Titian's audience would have been responsive to. They would have recognized symbols. They would have recognized the reappropriation or misappropriation of them and would have perhaps smiled knowingly, perhaps have congratulated the painter on his witty invention.
Woman as goddess and courtesan. Titian announced his presence as a master with a grand theatrical gesture. He concentrated the vast space of the Gothic Church of the Franciscans with another image of woman, woman as Madonna.
The culture itself had set up the perimeters of interpretive possibility. That is a scheme that talks about love on a scale of values. Love that at its basis is mere lust, love on that level being the love of the beast, of the animal, and that then rises through a series of progressive stages, through culturally licit lust, which is of course marital love, and that eventually arrives at the highest level, which is divine love.
Titian's Assumption of the Virgin is 20 feet high. In 1518, it was the largest oil painting ever produced, a painting on the scale to match the most ambitious artists in Rome. Yet Titian had never been to Rome, and he was developing the potential of what was still a new medium. Painting on this scale had previously been done in fresco, where the colors are absorbed into the plaster of the wall. But fresco in Venice was vulnerable to the damp climate. Only oils could give the brilliance and permanence that Titian needed to dominate the space.
Titian continued to exploit the spaces of the Frari, to dramatize them in the next painting that he executed for the church. This was the altarpiece of the Pesaro family, located on an altar to the left of the nave. It was visible to the viewer along a diagonal axis before he even reached the altar. And Titian's perspective deliberately offers an invitation to the viewer to enter the painting before arriving at the altar.
The Pesaro Madonna altarpiece illustrates vividly the fusion between church and state, public and private, St. Peter and St. Francis. The Virgin and Child are brought together with members of a Venetian noble family. The several monuments to the Pesaro family in the Church of the Frari are both private burial chapels and public statements of their prominent role in the nobility of the Republic. Jacopo Pesaro commissioned the artist to portray him giving thanks to the Virgin for his victory at the Battle of Santa Maria, when the Venetians and the Pope united to defeat the Turks. Pesaro, the Venetian, was admiral of the papal fleet. The spectacle of state included processions from the Doge's palace to the most prominent churches across the water, each designed by Andrea Palladio as a classical temple transformed for Christian celebration. Palladio adopted the monumental simplicity of ancient Roman buildings to make a new kind of Christian church. And he created spaces of unprecedented clarity.
A very different light actually suffuses the paintings that Tintoretto created for the presbytery of Palladio's church. It is not that clear light of a measured and harmonious universe. It is a much more turbulent light, a light that emerges from darkness.
Jacopo Tintoretto created a symbolic drama with scenes from the Old and New Testaments. Across the altar, opposite the descent of manna from heaven, is his version of the Last Supper. Tintoretto organized the perspective so the paintings were best seen from the altar steps by worshippers taking the bread and wine of the Mass.
Christ is shown distributing the bread that will be his body in the Mass. Up above, a great glory of angels, gossamer forms painted with broad, sweeping strokes, articulates the darkness as light suffused, a holy presence. Down below, dogs play, cats, animals. The hierarchy that is implicit in Tintoretto's painting, that is the hierarchy that runs from the base level of animals, of the dogs, to the level of the angels up above, is a hierarchy that is almost inherent in the painting of 16th century Venice. That is a hierarchy from the material to the spiritual. This is almost a game that Tintoretto plays in many of his paintings, giving us, as it were, footholds of substance, footholds of reality, just enough to convince us of the reality itself of the painting, and then he takes us into a flight. And we follow. We follow because we've been given that first foundation that we believe in. Tintoretto's spirituality is a spirituality that is predicated upon realizing, making real what had been, in effect, symbolic. Painting, in other words, gives substance to the spirit.
Daniele Barbaro personified the Venetian union of the spiritual and the actual. He was an ordained churchman and a Venetian nobleman, a farmer and a classical scholar. Together with Palladio, he translated an ancient treatise on architecture by Vitruvius. And together with Palladio and the painter Veronese, he gave those ideas form in a villa on the Venetian mainland. Palladio's designs for villas and churches dominated the taste of subsequent generations. His influence can be seen in country houses built in Europe and the Americas over the next 400 years. Palladio wrote himself,
"This fabric is in Mazere, the castle belonging to the magnificent Barbaro brothers. There is a fountain behind the house with infinite ornaments of stucco and paintings. This fountain forms a small lake which serves for a fish pond. From this place, the water runs into the kitchen, thence waters the gardens, full of the most excellent fruits." City houses are certainly of great splendor and convenience to a gentleman, but perhaps he will not reap less utility and consolation from the country house, where the remaining part of the time would be passed in seeing and adorning his own possessions, and by industry and the art of agriculture improving his estate, where also by the exercise which in a villa is commonly taken on foot and on horseback, the body will more easily preserve its strength and health, and finally, where the mind, fatigued by the agitations of the city, will be greatly restored and comforted, and be able quietly to attend the studies of letters and contemplation.
Paolo Veronese gave full pictorial expression to the harmonic values that informed Daniele Barbaro's conception of the ancient villa. Under the aegis of the ancient Olympian deities, of the seasons, of the elements, he placed members of the Barbaro family, actual portraits. The landscapes evoked those of ancient Roman villa decoration, but at the same time, they reached out into the surrounding territory of the Veneto to the actual Barbaro lands.
Veronese invented landscapes based on descriptions by ancient Roman writers, yet he placed among his fictional ruins and temples a portrait of the villa itself. And the Barbari and their servants took their place among the gods.
The Barbaro family itself, the clan, its villa, its land, its own small world becomes a microcosmic reflection of the macrocosm of the larger order. Palladio's plan for the villa very clearly marks each room with a number. The numbers themselves fall into very particular relationships. That is, these are harmonic relationships, harmonic proportions, the numerical representation of musical harmony. Musical harmony is seen metaphorically, of course, on the largest scale as the harmony of the universe. So that, in effect, the Barbaro family was living, we might say quite literally, in tune with the universe.
So in the villa at Mazere, Veronese reenacts the role of a painter from ancient times. Palladio becomes a new Vitruvius, and Barbaro a new Pliny, a patron in the Roman tradition. But of course, these scholarly games were being played out in a real world of political and economic change. The stability of the Venetian Empire was being undermined throughout the 16th century. By the late 1500s, the land holdings of the Veneto had become more and more important to the Venetian nobility. They invested in land reclamation, which would feed them in the short term, but also protect them from the full consequences of a decline in their status as traders. As the century progressed, so did the threat to Venetian trade, from the Ottoman Turks in the east and the new empires in the west. The crisis in the church, Reformation and Counter-Reformation, added a further burden of uncertainty. The gap between rhetoric and reality was widening. Yet, as the century moved to a close, the investment in the theatre of illusion, if anything, increased. The citizens of Vicenza, one of the leading cities of the Venetian mainland, commissioned Palladio to create an actual theatre in the imagined manner of the ancient Greeks. In the Teatro Olimpico, they demanded the erection of statues of themselves as lasting monuments to their dignity, wisdom, and wealth. For their first production of Oedipus the Tyrant by Sophocles, Andrea Gabrieli attempted to compose the music of classical Greece, and Veronese designed the costumes. Painting, too, became ever more theatrical, and in the case of Veronese's version of The Last Supper, gave cause for a drama of power and religion in which the artist became the main character in a conflict with the Inquisition.
Veronese was called before the Inquisition to answer questions about his painting of the Last Supper, a painting that was filled with all sorts of offensive details. There were to be found dwarfs, jesters, animals, and perhaps above all, German soldiers. In the age of the Counter-Reformation, the presence of German soldiers could hardly be accepted with equanimity.
What is the significance of those armed men dressed as Germans, each with a halberd in his hand?
We painters take the same license the poets and the jesters take. The two halberdiers are placed here so that they might be of service, because it seemed to me fitting, according to what I have been told, that the master of the house, who was great and rich, should have such servants.
And that man dressed as a buffoon, with a parrot on his wrist. For what purpose did you paint him on that canvas?
For ornament, as is customary.
Just tell us, who are at the table of our Lord?
The 12 apostles.
What is St. Peter, the first one, doing?
Carving the lamb, in order to pass it to the other end of the table.
What is the apostle next to him doing?
He is holding a dish in order to receive what St. Peter will give him.
Who do you really believe was present at that supper?
I believe one would find Christ with his apostles. But if in a picture there is some space to spare, I enrich it with figures according to the stories.
Did anyone commission you to paint Germans, buffoons, and similar things?
No, my lords. But I received the commission to decorate the picture as I saw fit. It is large, and, it seemed to me, it could hold many figures.
The judgment of the Inquisition demanded that Veronese change the content of his painting. Instead, he changed its title. So for subsequent centuries, Veronese's Last Supper has been known as the Feast at the House of Levi. In this one instance, we see the assertion of Venetian independence, the Republic defying the Roman Church, but also its vulnerability to an outside world of political and economic enemies. Floating on its islands and lagoons, Venice has always been different. The age of Titian, Tintoretto, and Veronese was its last period of political greatness. The 17th century would see the decline of its empire, just as the economic center of gravity of the West was beginning to shift away from the Mediterranean to the Atlantic and the new seaborne empires of Antwerp and London. But in its image of itself, Venice left behind a potent myth which endured its loss of real power, the myth of the ideal state. For it came to personify the best kinds of government, united in one body politic. And Venetian art is uniquely bound up with that history and that myth, above all in its expression of the harmony between human beings, the state, nature, and of course the artist.
Though siren-like on shore and sea, her face enchants all those whom once she doth embrace. Nor is there any can her beauty prize, but he who hath beheld her with his eyes. These things display, if well observed, how she so long her maidenhead preserved. How, for sound prudence, she still bore the bell. Whence may be drawn this high-fetched parallel. Venus and Venice are great queens in their degree. Venus is queen of love, Venice of polity.
Funding for Art of the Western World was provided by the Annenberg CPB project.
As the 16th century ended and the 17th began, here in Catholic Rome there was a feeling of jubilation, a sense of rebirth. Pope Paul V, in the year of our Lord 1612, has brought water 35 miles from the healthiest springs in Bracciano through new and restored aqueducts. What better way to signal the revival of the ancient grandeur of Rome than to restore its renowned system for bringing water from the distant mountains to the city streets? Pope Paul's new water supply, the Acqua Paula, or Paul's water, as it was called in his honor, was soon rushing out into the daylight from splendid fountains all around the city. The finest of these fountains was designed by the great sculptor and architect Gian Lorenzo Bernini. It was built in the Piazza Navona, which stood on the foundations of an ancient stadium, a material expression of the idea of eternal Rome.
The city had survived 100 years of political and religious turmoil, of war and destruction. Despite the invasions of various European monarchs who'd attempted to conquer the city on the pretext of defending it, it had preserved its independence. And most important, the Catholic Church had survived the rise of Protestantism and its challenge to the authority of Rome. And it was now in the midst of a most extraordinary period of expansion, as European colonization and exploration took its influence to the farthest corners of the earth. This Roman Catholic renewal, which historians call the Counter-Reformation, was given added purpose and vigor by a remarkable group of visionaries.
The Spanish mystic and philosopher Teresa of Avila insisted that everyone could experience intense and personal knowledge of God. Ignatius Loyola, the founder of the Jesuit teaching order, inspired his followers to go out to work with spiritual fervor in the real world. And the missionary Francis Xavier carried to distant India and Japan the message of the Roman Church. To fulfill the needs of the resurgent church, artists and architects from all over Europe flocked into Rome. They came to design and ornament the churches that were built in the explosion of activity inspired by the Counter-Reformation. The church reformers called for works of art and architecture that would bring the people into the churches, inspire faith and religious commitment. An artistic revival resulted, and a new style. It was an exuberant style, reflecting the optimism and assertiveness of the 17th century church.
This style is known as the Baroque.
The fresco on the ceiling above our heads was painted by Pietro da Cortona in the 1630s. It decorates the reception hall of the Barberini Palace in Rome, the family home of Pope Urban VIII, a great patron of the arts. To the modern sensibility, moulded by the notion that less is more, it may seem merely decorative and probably confusing. But a careful look at this work, done at the height of the Baroque period, reveals a well-thought-out design based on a program or written plan. When Urban looked up at his ceiling, he saw the figure of divine providence stretch her arms to a chorus of maidens who carried the emblem of his family, the Barberini bees. They carried the bees up to the crossed keys of St. Peter, the symbol of the papacy, and to the papal crown. The painting is meant to be read. It tells us that Pope Urban VIII is a great and worthy man, but it also tells us that the ideals of the classical world have been subordinated to the values of triumphant Christianity. Every figure in this swirling panorama has meaning. The scenes painted around the sides of the ceiling, for instance, tell stories extolling the Pope's virtues. His unyielding battle against heresy is here symbolized by Athena destroying insolence and pride in the shape of the giants. Here his piety conquers lust and intemperance, represented by the satyrs. Like the artists of the Renaissance, Cortona uses the vocabulary of classical antiquity, but he draws his figures naturalistically, with lifelike vigor and sensuality. The architectural elements are not real, but are painted as if they were. They blur the distinction between real and illusory space, at the same time suggesting hidden depths out of which the painted figures seem to tumble. Overlapping layers of light and dark create a sensation of breathtaking movement. In this one ceiling, we have all the elements of the high Baroque style. A clearly defined program, a dynamic and dramatic tension between naturalism and classicism, between illusion and reality, between light and dark, and always movement.
Why were Baroque artists concerned with illusion and reality, with light and dark, with movement, time and space? Before the 16th century, the Earth was believed to be the unmoving center of the universe, about which sun, stars and planets all revolved. The existence of human beings and their salvation was the purpose of the universe. In 1543, the astronomer Copernicus published his work on the revolutions of heavenly bodies. His revelation that the Earth moved around the sun challenged people's perceptions of themselves. The title page of Galileo's book on the solar system shows Copernicus demonstrating to the revered ancient philosophers Aristotle and Ptolemy that their view had been wrong. The Earth was just one of many celestial bodies, all of which obeyed the same impartial laws. At about the same time that Europeans learned that the Earth was not the center of the universe, the discovery of the Americas and the exploration of the Far East revealed that Europe was not the center of the world. In this time of spiritual crisis, provoked by the explosion of knowledge, artists sought new ways of seeing and understanding. The art-thrust left arm of the Disciple startled and astonished its first viewers in 1600. It breaks into the space in which we stand. The naturalism of this painting of Christ at Emmaus by Michelangelo Merisi, known as Caravaggio, was unprecedented. Its intention is to convince us that we're actually participants in this astonishing event, God's presence in the flesh. We may no longer regard the earth as unique, Caravaggio seems to be saying, but God has dwelt amongst us. Divinity and sanctity are to be found in our midst. Caravaggio went out into the streets of Rome and put the people he found there in his paintings. He came to Rome from northern Italy in the last decade of the 16th century. A strange, violent, driven man, he was in permanent revolt against authority. Caravaggio was always in trouble with the police. Just around the corner from here, on the Campo dei Fiori, he killed a man in a quarrel and had to flee the city. He was a carouser and a libertine and painted himself that way. But the way he painted religious subjects was as shocking to his contemporaries as his behavior. He painted St. Peter as a confused and frightened old man. The Virgin in life as a neighborhood housewife. The Virgin in death he painted as a swollen, careworn corpse. The painting was rejected by the monks who commissioned it. Never before had they seen the Virgin Mary represented as dead rather than dying. Caravaggio was rebelling against idealized depictions, such as this Conversion of St. Paul by Taddeo Zuccaro. This was the conventional way in which divine intervention on earth was portrayed, like a fabulous dream. But Caravaggio sought to draw the beholder in, to make the worshipper a participant in the drama enacted on the canvas. In a small chapel in the church of Santa Maria del Popolo in Rome, Caravaggio's Conversion of St. Paul depicts the intrusion of the divine into human life as a real moment, meant to be seen from the perspective of someone kneeling in prayer. A contemporary commented that it looked like an accident in a blacksmith's shop. But Caravaggio, in the spirit of the Counter-Reformation saints, was pleading through his pictures for man's direct knowledge of God. One of the principal devices he used to achieve his purpose was chiaroscuro, the contrast of light and dark in the canvas. Caravaggio rejected the convention of attributing the light source to a radiant divine figure. Here no divinity is visible. There is no explanation for the light source within the painting. Light just appears and totally overwhelms Paul. Light itself is the presence of God. Darkness is where God is not. Caravaggio was one of the first artistic bohemians. Rebellious, uncompromising and dissolute, he died at 37. Late in his short life, he portrayed himself as the decapitated Goliath. It's the work of a deeply religious man, depicting his own damnation. While Caravaggio saw himself in the headless Goliath,
the young Gian Lorenzo Bernini gave his features to the heroic David.
Bernini took the immediacy he found in Caravaggio's paintings and recreated it in marble with phenomenal and unprecedented virtuosity. The sculptors of the Renaissance had often treated the David theme. Donatello's David is serenely elegant. Michelangelo's is contained, perfect, full of potential. But Bernini's David moves, turns aggressively to confront the observer. True to the spirit of the Baroque, this David is meant to be experienced. The viewpoint in this case, of course, is that of Goliath. It's said that the Cardinal Maffeo Barberini himself held a mirror to Bernini's face so that the young prodigy could use his own expression of intense concentration as the model for the David. When the Cardinal became Pope Urban VIII, he said to the artist, "It is your good luck to see Maffeo Barberini Pope. But we are even luckier, for the Cavaliere Bernini lives at the time of our pontificate." There is scarcely a corner of Rome that was not graced by Bernini's touch. From the small, witty adornment, the elephant and the obelisk in the little piazza of Santa Maria sopra Minerva, to the vast piazza and its enclosing colonnade in front of the Basilica of St. Peter. He is a rare man, said Urban VIII, and a sublime artist, born by divine disposition and for the glory of Rome.
These statements by the great Pope about his favorite artist are significant in two ways. They were prophetic of the prodigious role Bernini would play in his works for Urban and the succeeding popes for a period of 60 years. Rome was transformed into a modern city, replete with public monuments meant not just for the elite, but for everyone to admire and enjoy. The open arms of the vast porticos in front of St. Peter's convey exactly this sense of outreach, beyond the traditional bonds of society, to include every individual in a universal embrace. This concern is made visible in what Bernini described as his least bad work. The Cornaro family chapel, dedicated to the 16th century Spanish mystic Saint Teresa of Avila, which Bernini created about 1650 in the church of Santa Maria della Vittoria in Rome. Our eyes are met by those of the cardinal patron, who looks out from among his ancestors and accompanies the visitor down the nave to view the chapel from the center of the crossing. There we are confronted with a spectacle of truly cosmic proportions. In the pavement before the altar, gesticulating skeletons rise from the lower depths to face their maker at the end of time. The vault of the chapel has scenes from Teresa's life. Bernini makes a chorus of winged and cloud-born angels singing, playing instruments, and strewing flowers seem to filter through the solid vault, filling the chapel with their fragrant hymns of praise and celebration. At the sides, the members of the Cornaro family appear in balconies with architectural backgrounds whose perspectives merge with that of the church. Their space becomes indistinguishable from ours. They consider, study, discuss, describe, indicate, and thereby bear witness to a mysterious event in which they participate, encouraging us to join them. Here, Bernini created a visual sensation by making a literal portrayal of a woman in ecstasy. From time immemorial, mystics have used the vocabulary of earthly love to convey their feelings to others. Communion with God is like communion with the lover, only infinitely more so. In her autobiography, Teresa describes the famous vision of the Transverberation.
In the angel's hands I saw a long golden spear, and at the end of the iron tip I seemed to see a point of fire. With this he pierced my heart several times so that it penetrated my entrails. When he drew it out, he left me completely afire with a great love for God.
The prime tenet of Christianity is that God created the world out of his love for humanity. Bernini made love and creation the key to his chapel.
Baroque architecture follows different laws from those of antiquity and the Renaissance. Gone is the stately equilibrium and logic. Instead, the framework seems to move, the boundaries seem to melt and walls to dance. The very stone seems to bend itself to the will of the architect. The most willful architect of them all was Francesco Borromini. Sant'Ivo della Sapienza is Borromini's masterpiece. His architecture is intellectually complex, a startling amalgam of mathematics and fantasy. He knew the history of architecture and drew upon the past boldly and freely. The facade curves in, but the dome above it curves out, presenting the beholder with a dramatic contrast. Using a symmetry so odd that it seems almost asymmetrical, he opposes convex and concave arcs. The result is that the building itself seems to be alive and pulsating. Borromini's work emphasized one of the central teachings of the Roman Catholic Church in the 17th century. Salvation could not be attained by reason alone, nor by simple sensual experience. It required an imaginative leap of faith. In bewildering the eye and challenging the mind, Borromini sought to plunge the worshipper into the mystery of salvation. Not everyone understood. A contemporary critic wrote, "Everyone gets in his head a new idea and displays it in public squares and upon facades, madly deforming buildings and even towns." But an official of Borromini's church of San Carlo recorded, "Nothing similar with regard to artistic merit can be found anywhere in the world. Members of different nations arrive daily in Rome and try to procure plans of the church. We've been asked for them by Germans, Flemings, Frenchmen, Spaniards, and even Indians." The Baroque style in architecture that had its roots in Counter-Reformation Rome spread north into war-torn Germany and Austria. During most of the 17th century, Austria was preoccupied with its lonely fight against the encroaching armies of the Ottoman Turks. When the Austrians defeated the Muslim Turks at the gates of Vienna in 1683, a new era began. The Habsburg Holy Roman Emperors turned to rebuilding their ravaged land. All along the Danube, where bleak fortresses had guarded the river, a chain of magnificent abbeys was built. The victory over the Turks meant that money was now available for grand enterprises. The monks' taxes paid for buildings rather than for weapons. These abbeys were meant to serve not only as religious communities, but also as hospices for the emperor. St. Florian's Abbey, begun in 1689, is the work of an Italian and an Austrian. Carlo Carlone and Jacob Prantal. In true Baroque fashion, the new abbey was a stage upon which royal ritual could be played out by the visiting emperor. Paradoxically, the stage usually lacked its leading actor, for the emperor himself rarely visited any of the abbeys. But it didn't matter. The object was not imperial housing. It was to make a political point, to bear witness to the unity of Christianity and empire. Here we're dealing not with the glorification of an individual emperor, but with the need to assert the divine right to rule of an institution, the Habsburg Empire. Newly victorious over the Turks, the Austrians believed themselves to be the saviors of Christian Europe. They proclaimed their triumph in their art and in their architecture. The Karlskirche, or Charles Church in Vienna, is an example of the power of the Christian faith to absorb and transfigure many influences. The gabled portico reminds us of the Pantheon. The columns suggest Trajan's column in imperial Rome, as well as the Bible's description of Solomon's temple. The dome is like the domes of papal Rome. At the ends of the building, the two towers suggest an imperial fortress. Begun in 1716, the Charles Church is the work of Fischer von Erlach, who studied the work of Bernini and Borromini in Rome. It's dedicated to Charles Borromeo, one of the great Counter-Reformation saints. It is not a coincidence that the Austrian emperor at the time was also named Charles. For in the lands where absolute monarchs ruled, architecture was part of the vocabulary of royal power. The Belvedere Palace in Vienna was built in 1721 for Prince Eugene of Savoy, the general who led the Austrians to their victory over the Turks. The architect was Lucas von Hildebrandt. The Belvedere actually consists of two palaces set at opposite ends of an enormous formal garden in which nature has been completely subdued. The design is based on a simple program. Together, the two palaces and the garden present the visitor with an allegory of life's journey. At one end, where Prince Eugene lived, is the lower Belvedere and its gardens, representing the earth. At the other end, where visitors were received, the upper Belvedere, are the heavens. At first, you think you can go directly to the palace. The path appears straight. But you find that you cannot. The grand staircase in the center of the garden reveals itself as you approach to be a cascade, water. You must go to the left or to the right. The garden forces you to be a player in an allegory of the human journey to eternity. The palace faces north, so there's always a shadow on its facade. Like the heaven it represents, you can't read its features until you're very close. As you arrive at the entrance hall of the upper Belvedere, you're reminded that you may have to struggle like Hercules to stay on the right path. At last, the grand staircase brings you to the hall of the emperor. In the end, the journey is worth taking, for if you proceed correctly, you arrive at your goal. This has not been a dismal journey. It has taken place, after all, in a garden, a reminder that the earth can be a happy place, at least for the privileged few who might find themselves here as the guests of Prince Eugene.
Like much art throughout history then, Baroque was optimistic. But whose optimism? The 17th century was certainly a period of great expansiveness in European culture, both in geographical space and in the mind. But it was also the time of the Inquisition, of bitter religious wars which devastated the continent, and the time in which despotic monarchs dressed up their naked power in the trappings of benevolence. The style in which they did this can be seen all around us here in the Belvedere Palace. The Italian Baroque artists who developed this visual language used it to express the faith, confidence, and power of the Catholic Counter-Reformation Church. It was a style ideally suited to expressing the interworkings of heavenly and earthly rule. And so, here in Vienna, as throughout Europe, kings and states seized upon this language to make their assertion that their authority was sanctioned by God. It was a style which had a long life. Indeed, it still speaks power to us today.
The equestrian portrait, the man on horseback. The standard mode for portraying aristocratic and royal rulers. The ruler powerfully up, the subject safely down.
Kings and princes were trained to ride horses in the improbable manner that we see portrayed in equestrian portraits. The idea was that they should be seen to control a rearing horse with just one hand on the reins. Surely such a person could confidently rule and command a kingdom.
Images of power tell us a great deal about the people who make them, but even more about the people who commission them. The dynastic monarchs of 17th century Europe, their power increasingly challenged by far-reaching social and economic change, sought to present themselves as the heirs of the Roman emperors, their authority divinely ordained. For them, art was an instrument of state power just as armies were, important in directing and maintaining the absolute obedience of their subjects. We've seen how the Counter-Reformation Church demanded of its artists that their images should inflame the religious imagination of the people. Just so, kings required of their court painters that their images should convey a sense of their benevolence, their dignity, their wealth, their taste, and their divine right to rule.
In 1622, Maria de Medici, the mother of King Louis XIII of France, commissioned Peter Paul Rubens to paint for her new home in the Luxembourg Palace a series of more than 30 enormous canvases. They were to commemorate the 4 years when she ruled as regent after the assassination of her husband, Henry IV, until her son Louis came of age in 1614. Even though Maria was only the regent and not really the queen at all, Rubens employs the full apparatus of glamour, power, and glory to proclaim the greatness of her rule. Her late husband, King Henry, is shown being carried off to heaven. Yet all the action rushes towards Maria, whose position in the painting is higher than the king's. A little odd, since he is the one on the way to heaven. But it's in the religious paintings that Rubens pulls out all the stops. His church paintings, such as the Descent from the Cross in the cathedral at Antwerp, serve the requirements of Roman Catholic Counter-Reformation ideology. Inspiring faith, inducing piety. The immediacy and individuality of the figures, the use of great circling arcs in the sweeping compositions, his dazzling use of color, all contribute to the heightened emotionalism that was intended to lift the spectator out of the everyday world into a state of exaltation. His works are the most powerful expression of triumphant Christianity. Rubens achieved his success early, as we see in this youthful self-portrait, together with his first wife. He was the superstar of the art world of the day, the most collected painter of his time, and the most esteemed court painter in Europe, when in 1628 he was summoned to Spain to paint the king.
From his capital at Madrid, Philip IV ruled the greatest empire in the world, with dominions stretching from the Philippines to Peru. But bogged down by a long war in the Netherlands, the most powerful state in Europe was about to slip into decline.
As so often in history, at a time beset with uncertainty, the arts flourished. Of the painters he met at Philip's court, Rubens was particularly impressed by one, the young Diego Velázquez. Velázquez was an original who would paint a classical subject like the god Bacchus getting drunk with a group of real peasants. Velázquez first drew the attention of the court with his early paintings of simple, unheroic subjects of daily life, what we call genre paintings. They were startling pictures, depicting things never before painted, such as the precise moment at which cooking eggs solidified. Like many of the young painters of his time, Velázquez was profoundly influenced by the naturalism of the Italian Caravaggio. Caravaggio placed miraculous events in a familiar, naturalistic setting. Velázquez fused the real and the mythological to create a new, psychologically penetrating reality. In the Forge of Vulcan, he chooses the moment when the god Apollo tells Vulcan that his wife, Venus, is making love to Mars, the god of war. Velázquez combines theatrical gesture with the astonished faces of real workmen set in an authentic forge. He quickly became a favorite portrait painter of King Philip. As court painter, Velázquez would make a portrait of one of the royal family. In his studio, assistants then made copies which were sent out to foreign courts. This was an important part of the diplomatic process of the day, especially of the business of finding marriage partners for royal offspring. Secure in his position as court painter, Velázquez turned his attention to formal and painterly innovation. In his portraits of the jesters and dwarfs at the court, Velázquez was free to experiment. He understood that paintings made according to the classical rules produced something other than what the eye sees. The eye cannot focus simultaneously on different planes. Here, Velázquez treats the background to a portrait as a blur. It works the way the eye sees. The boldest and most daring of Velázquez paintings is explored for us by Professor Simon Schama of Harvard University.
Las Meninas is, in the most literal sense, a challenging painting. Coming on it, we are challenged by no less than 6 pairs of eyes, trained intently on us. The effect is distinctly unsettling. It's rather as though we'd blundered into a corner of the royal domain where we had no business being.
But one pair of eyes and one pair of hands, those of the artist, ensure that once we've strayed into Velázquez's magic box, we can't casually take our leave and move on to whatever else happens to be in the next gallery.
Pinned to the spot by the most extraordinary visual conundrum ever painted, our first reaction is probably to find out as best as we can what exactly is going on here.
The most incurious explanation, but one we can surely start with, is that Velázquez has offered us an informal glimpse into his working day, producing one of the many portraits he executed of the royal princesses, designed to advertise their desirability in one of the marriages on which dynastic politics so crucially turned. Royal inbreeding had its problems, especially for the Spanish Habsburgs, exaggerating their family trademarks, pop eyes and lantern chin, and as if to compensate for this rather unpromising raw material, Velázquez provided brilliant production numbers, gorgeously costumed, using a daring blob and blotch technique to give the illusion of a dancing light playing on the kind of fabric, satins, silks, and taffetas that would best show them off.
What else do we know for sure about this painting? From an account published half a century after Velázquez's death, we know that the scene is set in the royal palace of the Alcazar, in a room set aside for the use of the royal painter, one which he turned into his studio. Velázquez himself had been given responsibility for decorating the palace and installing its paintings, including 2 by Rubens that we can see dimly hanging at the back of the painting. The same account manages to identify nearly everybody in the composition: the 5-year-old princess, the Infanta Margarita, the maids of honors, the Maninas themselves, courtiers and guards. By setting himself down amidst all this royal company, Velázquez, decorated with the knightly cross of Santiago, is staking out a claim to the nobility of his calling in a culture where to be a painter usually precluded being a gentleman. The real subject of Las Meninas is not the royal princess, still less is it Velázquez's social pretensions. The true subject is the art of painting itself. In the course of the painting, Velázquez shows us his whole box of tricks, illusions of space, depth, and perspective. Yet he always withholds from us the exact means by which he executes those extraordinary effects and illusions. Las Meninas really is a conjuring trick of the greatest genius. Like all conjuring tricks, it teases and provokes us by multiplying uncertainties. We can't even be sure of the exact subject matter of the painting on which Velázquez is working and whose surface is actually hidden from us. Perhaps it is not the princess at the front of the painting, but a portrait of the king and queen whose image we belatedly realize is reflected on the mirror at the back wall. Yet in this cunning game between artist and beholder, there is a third possibility, namely that mirror reflection is not actually of the painting, but of the real king and queen, who've dropped by to observe, like royal eavesdroppers, their artist at work. Now, in that case, this would put me in front of the picture plane in the disconcerting position of the shoes of Philip IV. In all likelihood, the painting was meant for the private pleasure of the king alone, and the privileged eavesdropping implied by the reflection would certainly explain all the attentiveness of those gazes directed in different ways at the royal intruder. Yet there really is nothing deferential about this painting at all. In this realm, it is the artist rather than the king who is sovereign. Well, after all these amazing visual fireworks, it comes as something of an anticlimax to learn that Velázquez spent the later part of his life in an almost obsessive quest for gentlemanly status. The snobbery that made him hunger to be a knight of the Order of Santiago may seem degrading to us, perhaps. After all, the nobility of the man lay in his art, which he had taken to undreamt of levels of sophistication and technical virtuosity. Perhaps our disappointment is just a measure of the huge distance from his culture to ours. His sublimely confident play with illusion and reality, with certainty and uncertainty, seems to make us want to recruit him as a fellow traveler of the modern world. But the knight of the Order of Santiago, surrounded by other servants of the cult of royalty, dwarves, maids of honor, princesses and courtiers, stares back at us, the hidden contents of his enigmatic painting, forever denying us that familiarity.
Even more successfully than Velázquez, Rubens played the court game to perfection. As the years passed, honors piled up. He was knighted. He undertook difficult diplomatic missions. But religious and territorial wars in Northern Europe raged on. Rubens grew discouraged. He withdrew from court and public life and went home to the baronial house he owned in Antwerp. His first wife had long since died, and he married the 16-year-old Helena Formant. It has been suggested that he was satirically alluding to himself and Helena when he painted this aging but still lusty satyr carrying off a young nymph. His paintings joyfully and sensually celebrated his love for Helena. He purchased the castle of Stein, and with his family and his titles, retired to a twilight fantasy of country life as the Lord of Stein. Rubens' landscapes are suffused with a kind of nostalgia. They evoke a dream of an aristocratic life, a life based on the ownership of land. Today, it's only half an hour or so by car or train from the landlocked aristocratic landscape that Rubens painted to the seascapes, rivers and canals of the Dutch Netherlands. Though not far apart physically, these two societies were as different at heart as the landscapes they inhabited. The Dutch escaped from feudalism by making new land. They built dikes against the sea in a vast communal effort that continues to this day. They made their own precarious land, and their peculiar geography made them. Vermeer's view of Delft shows us a secure town that has confidently mastered its difficult environment. The sea shaped Dutch society. But 80 bitter years of a cruel and bloody war for independence from their Spanish rulers created a Dutch nation. In the middle of the 17th century, the 7 northern provinces of the Netherlands emerged victorious from their struggle for independence and established the predominantly Protestant Dutch Republic. In a Europe dominated by absolutist and Catholic monarchies, Spain, France, Austria, the Republic was an island of relative freedom.
And the town hall of the Dutch city of Amsterdam, built in the 17th century, tells us something about the life and the ideals of the Dutch Republic. It has none of the qualities of absolutist architecture. Here, no grand colonnade leads the world into a central focus, as at St. Peter's, Rome. No succession of rooms and corridors and staircases takes us to the monarch's bedroom, as at Louis XIV's palace at Versailles. What you have here in Amsterdam are 7 simple, unpretentious doorways. The architecture of the new town hall, then, is an embodiment of the independent political aspirations of the Netherlands, an expression of Amsterdam's sense of itself as a free city at the center of the world.
In the 17th century, the Dutch city of Amsterdam was the greatest economic power in the world, a vast marketplace where every kind of goods could be had. Pepper, whale oil, Japanese lacquer, cloth, wine. The Dutch became rich. They were the most urban society in Europe, literate, stable, well-fed, and decently housed. They knew themselves to be fortunate. They strongly identified with the chosen people of the Old Testament, with all that implied about the need for piety and obedience to God's will. In this peculiar new society, artists could not look to the traditional sources of patronage. There was no royal court, and the Dutch Protestant churches had been stripped of pictures, as we can see in this painting of the Mariakerk in Utrecht by Peter Sanredam. Nevertheless, the Netherlands experienced an explosion in the production and consumption of art. The first mass art market in history arose because, for the first time, ordinary people bought paintings, etchings, and drawings. Artists produced in large quantity for that market. The society was defining itself in the images it produced. The simplicity of these domestic scenes is often deceptive. This still life with trout by Willem Claeszoon Heda, while reassuring the Dutch of the plenty in their lives, also warns them of the remorseless passage of time. Jan Steen's comic painting, The World Upside Down, was intended to amuse, but it also cautions against the dangers of excess. Here, drink and sexual license cause a household to slide into complete domestic disorder. Jan Vermeer's Woman Weighing Pearls stands before a painting of the Last Judgment, warning that wealth must not distract us from our ultimate fate. The Dutch genre paintings are not just innocent images of everyday life, but of the problems and moral crises of everyday life. Like other works of the Baroque period, they convey a message.
Ja, naar links. Ja, dat is heel mooi. Verder naar links. Oké, iets naar voren. Oké. Die heren achteraan.
Group portraits are still important today. In the 17th century Netherlands, they were essential, for power in the Dutch Republic was held not by a prince, but by corporate bodies, boards of governors, councils. And so the group portrait was, for the Dutch, the equivalent of the equestrian portrait in aristocratic and dynastic states.
Daar gaat hij.
In the hands of the most remarkable of the Dutch painters, the group portrait becomes an intense and purposeful expression of the group ethos. The Night Watch.
More has been written about Rembrandt than any other painter in the history of Western art. But if we had to think of one word that would sum up the essence of that art, it would probably be drama. All the elements of Rembrandt's art were put to the service of drama, none more so, perhaps, than light. His use of light was at the opposite extreme from Vermeer's. The Delft painter flooded his figures with an even, serene radiance, so that they sparkled with the intensity of an image caught by a lens. Rembrandt, on the other hand, turned the lights down low, plunging his histories into a theatrical darkness, the better to use his spotlight for dramatic emphasis and expressive brilliance. The painting was one of Rembrandt's most important assignments, but it was also perhaps one of the most difficult. Militia pieces were hard work. In this picture by Nicolas Eliazerne Piquenoy, we can see that they were much like boardroom or team photographs, expressions of the collective spirit. On the other hand, each of the sitters was paying a tidy sum to have his own individual likeness rendered as faithfully and as flatteringly as possible. So, conventionally, they are lined up in front of us in a shallow, elongated space, marked out from each other just by variations in uniform or by gestures of painful artificiality. Rembrandt brushed aside all these compromises. Instead of lining up his figures in a frieze-like format, he scooped out great hollows of recessed space at the back and front of the painting. And this sculpted space really gave Rembrandt the freedom that he needed to deploy his troops with animation. The drastically foreshortened hand of Captain Banin-Kok and the drastically foreshortened halberd, that weapon there, of Lieutenant Reichenberg, give the painting the quality of propulsion, so much movement forward that it almost threatens to trample the beholder with an irresistible onrush of energy. The painter seems to make virtue out of energetic disorder. It is, after all, how the Dutch often like to see themselves, full of dynamism and high spirits. At the same time, Rembrandt did his best to give the group a more soldierly appearance. The figures we see here loading the musket, shooting it off dangerously close to the lieutenant's hat, blowing the powder away from the top of the gun, all correspond to the warlike values which this group of soldiers still like to believe they embodied. It's a group portrait and a history painting, something that testifies to the reassuring disorderliness of plain citizens. It's really chaos on an epic scale, something which immediately expresses not dumb discipline, but high animal spirits, a boisterous riot of energy, movement, and visual noise that explodes out from its center towards us. In every sense, to give it its correct title, The March Out of the Company of Franz Banin-Kok.
The flair for drama that invests the Night Watch with so much energy carries over into Rembrandt's more intimate work. His portraits go far beyond the mere rendering of facial features and social position. In the eyes of Rembrandt's subjects, we read personal and private history and psychological nuance. Rembrandt made this self-portrait at the age of 23. It is Rembrandt's steady, deep, probing gaze, that penetrating look to something beyond the surface, that distinguishes what many consider his greatest work, that monument of self-scrutiny, his self-portraits. In about 40 paintings, 20 engravings, and 10 drawings, Rembrandt offers us himself, an individual. This extended act of self-portraiture was unprecedented in Western art. It may be instructive to look once more at Velázquez's great meditation on art. The painter confronts us with a challenging stare, daring us to follow his lead in contemplating the nature of perceived reality. But Velázquez stands in a highly structured social and political framework, which is part and parcel of the meaning of the painting. Rembrandt also portrays himself confronting the viewer and in relation to his craft. But Rembrandt is entirely alone with his palette, ready to define himself in his characteristic thick impasto, the paint troweled on and worked with his fingers rather than with the brush. Rembrandt, in his solitude, with his direct look and with his coarse, visibly applied paint, asserts his presence, his selfness, his individuality as the matter for contemplation.
In the story of Western art, the 17th century, the age of Baroque, began through much of Europe in subjection to the ideals of the Italian Renaissance. But by the end of the century, new artistic tastes had developed, new ways of seeing the world. Boldly naturalistic, richly sensual, ambitiously intellectual, passionate and profound. Baroque artists had served a variety of masters in achieving that. They had, as always, provided the images of power for absolute monarchs whose subjects now increasingly saw them as all too mortal. They had provided religious images to bolster a faith shaken by the rise of modern science and by religious conflict. But something else had happened. By the end of the century, Western artists had achieved, as never before, the depiction of inwardness. Look how Rembrandt fixes our gaze, draws us in, plays with our emotions, compelling our attention to the mystery of a single human heart.